As we look at our gospel today, the theme is basically about trust. So, if you think about it, would anybody sin if whenever they were tempted to sin, all of a sudden God was in front of them on his throne with his angels and his swords, and there was a pit open up to hell, and you could hear the screams and the flames coming out. And God says, "Oh, are you about to sin?" No, Lord. Perish the thought. No, I'm going to church to pray now. Thank you. So obviously, the only way there can be a test to reveal the true intentions of our heart and soul is where we are removed from immediate punishment, and the punishment is delayed, and we are somewhat removed from the presence of God to the point that we can kind of feel like we're on our own. Now, obviously, those conditions came as a result of original sin. Now, Adam could see God face to face. He didn't need faith. We only see God through the eyes of faith. And there's a lot of darkness of sin in the way, because we've had our intellect darkened and our will weakened as a result of original sin. So we struggle to do the right thing. We struggle to believe. We need to pray to increase our faith, to increase our ability to recognize God. So as we look here, we get some encouragement at the beginning of the gospel. Don't be afraid, little flock, for your Father is pleased to give you the kingdom. Of course he is. He went through a lot of trouble. His son dying on the cross, shedding his precious blood. He's given his life for the cause of our salvation. Now he's done his part. Now it's our turn. What are we going to do? We are in a position to be able to prove our trustworthiness. Sort of like, loosely speaking, parents leaving the teenagers home alone on the weekend. What are they going to do? Are they going to have a wild party and tear up the house? Or are they going to be responsible and do their homework, do their chores, be good, do their prayers? So you kind of have a situation somewhat like that. So what does he say after he says it pleased the Father to give you the kingdom? Sell your belongings and give alms. And you say, oh, interesting. So I need to show my love for the poor by giving to the extent that I can, giving alms. Provide money bags for yourselves that don't wear out. What is that? That's interesting. Well, the money bag that Jesus is speaking about is heavenly riches. An inexhaustible treasure where? In heaven, where there's no thief that can reach it, nor moth will destroy. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be. So what is Jesus telling us? The currency of this world belongs to this world, but we do not. We are passing through. So all the people that have the big money, you hear about them in the news, the billionaires and gazillionaires or whatever, well, I mean, I hope that some of them are men of faith and go to church maybe. I don't know. I don't know what their soul is like. But if they're living for this world and for the money, they got a problem, because the currency of heaven is not dollars, it's grace. Do we say Hail Mary full of money? We say Hail Mary full of grace. Do you think Mary would care if we offered her the winning lottery ticket? She's the Queen of heaven and earth, the Queen of angels and saints. She has a seat right next to Christ, the highest saint in heaven forever, never to be taken away from her. And she got there through being poor and detached from this world, by being a woman of faith and prayer and obedience to the commandments and the love of God and love of neighbor. A woman of charity and compassion and kindness. That's why we see her pictured with an immaculate heart. So it's important for us to recognize the big picture. Now, an example of some people who missed the boat, I remember in history class we studied the stock exchange and the big crash. Maybe I'm going to get the year wrong, but I think it was 1929, the big one. So people that had had fortunes, this is the old one, I'm old, so 1929, we'll talk about that. Anyway, forget about 2029, we're not there yet. But around that time, around 2029, When the stock market crashed, there were people who lost all their money and they were jumping out of the top floor of the buildings. Why would they do that? They're still alive. Some of them even young. Why would they? Because that was their whole life, the love of money and the love of this world. And they lost it and they felt they were as good as dead. Let's not be that sad, folks. Let's recognize there's a world beyond this one, that there's something beyond the body. Our soul, which can love and be loved. Our heart, our mind that can come to know one another and to know God and to learn the truths of God, learn the love of God, and choose the love of God, and choose the truth of God. So, as we look at our gospel here, he says, light your lamps like servants who wait their master's return from a wedding, ready to open immediately when he comes and knocks. When is Jesus going to come and knock? On the day that our soul leaves our body, we will go and see him face to face. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds vigilant on arrival. That's what we want to be, because you can flip that one around to cursed be those servants whom the master finds unfaithful. So he goes on and says, I tell you, he will have them recline at table. I like that part. I like my recliner. Going to be reclining at table in the kingdom of God. And then it says he will proceed to wait on them. Wow. Imagine that. The Lord will be rewarding us. And so, what does the waiter do? The waiter brings the food. The Lord brings us the heavenly food at Mass to the altar, and it comes to us. And so it's a foretaste of heaven. And so the idea of the Lord having us recline in eternity. Finally, the cross is over. The labor is over. We will get to rest. That's where we got to do it here. This is where we labor in the vineyard for the kingdom. If the master of the house had known the hour when the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You must also be prepared, for at an hour you do not expect the Son of Man will come. Now, what does that mean? Now, when I was in high school, I first heard that. I'm like, wait a minute now. Jesus is a thief? I thought we're not supposed to steal. What's going on? So he's a thief? Well, it depends on where you are in the equation. If you're a good person, he doesn't come as a thief. He comes like Santa Claus with presents to reward you. But if you're bad, he comes as a thief. Think about Hitler, Uncle Joe Stalin, Mao Zedong, all those people who had their kingdom in this world that didn't care about God, didn't care who they killed or what they had to do to have power, money, property, control. And then the Lord comes and says, it's time to pass into eternity to the next world. You're leaving your money and your power and your army behind, and your body as well. You're coming with me. For them, yeah, he comes as a thief, because he's taking away their opportunity to sin and their labor of evil and its produce. As we go on further, Jesus talks again, who is the faithful and prudent steward? So we're supposed to be faithful and prudent with what God gives us, whom the master will put in charge of his servants to distribute the food allowance at the proper time. I always immediately think of the patriarch Joseph, the end of Genesis. So Joseph is there, and the whole world comes to Joseph to get their bread. And the idea of Joseph saving the grain for 7 years and the bread is pointing to the bread of life, which feeds the whole world, not the body but the soul. The bread of life, the living bread, comes down from heaven, the Eucharist. Blessed is that servant whom his master finds on arrival doing what he's supposed to do. The master will put the servant in charge of all his property. Look at that. A beautiful insight into heaven. Now, sometimes people think we're going to be taking harp lessons forever on a cloud. It's going to be really boring in heaven. I don't think it's going to be that way. So Jesus isn't telling us specifically what it's going to be like in heaven, but when he says the master will put the servant in charge of all his property, That sounds pretty good. We're going to have a share in the kingdom of God, and we will have eternal responsibilities. If we take the temporary things that he gives us here and now and use them faithfully and prudently, like good stewards, then God will give us eternal wealth, eternal kingdom, an eternal place at his side. But if that servant says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, begins to beat the men servants and the maid servants, that's a violation of the fifth commandment, to be abusive to our neighbor, using power like a bully, to eat and drink and get drunk, again the fifth commandment, then that servant's master will come at an unexpected day and an unknown hour, will punish that servant severely and assign him a place with the unfaithful. We don't want to be that. And a lot of times it's easy to get mad at politicians, who are attacking the child in the womb and the family and legislating against the commandments of God, against the gospel, trying to do all they can to attack the gospel and the family. I feel sorry for them ultimately, because this is all they got forever. It's a pretty lousy heaven. If you want to have your heaven on earth, it's lousy. Because it ain't heaven, that's for sure. It's very temporary, it's very limited, very imperfect, and it's going to be very gone very soon. I put my faith and life plan in the hands of the Lord. He's the one who is eternal. He's the one that gave us youth and life. You say, well, as you get older, your youth is gone. I'm not so worried about my youth being gone. As long as I'm connected with God, the source of all life, all youth, God gives us a new body at the resurrection that will never grow old. Jesus says in the book of Revelation, behold, I make all things new, because I'm the one that made everything in the beginning. I'm the one that gave you everything. So when God gives us these things, we remember everything came from God. So let's use it in the service of God. But what is the worldly mentality? They take the gifts of God and use it against God, against the commandments, against the kingdom, against the church, against the family and the people, so that they can get some temporary sinful gain for a few years in this world, and then the Lord's coming as a thief in the night to take it away from them. Not a smart thing. So now we see how our knowledge plays into our judgment. I remember as a kid when we would mess up, sometimes a lot of people would fail the class, so the teacher would go in. I remember one time we all failed, and the teacher gave everyone 30 points. All of a sudden, most people passed. So God grades on a curve. What does Jesus say on the cross? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. What do we see here in the Gospel of Luke? The servant who knew his master's will but did not make preparations nor act in accord with his will, in other words, they're not doing it, will be beaten severely. I don't want to find out what that is. Beating in this world is scary enough. A beating severely in the next world, don't want to know what that means. And the servant who is ignorant of his master's will but acted in a way deserving of severe beating shall be beaten only lightly. So God's going to judge us on a curve. Much will be required of the person entrusted with much, and more with the one entrusted with more. So God knows what we know. And so some of the people maybe in the world who haven't had the benefit of being raised by a good family in the faith, and they have a limited knowledge, God's going to take that into account when their judgment comes. But we have been entrusted with true riches, worth more than anything in the world. We have been given, if we've had good parents or a good friend who brought us to church, the faith, the gospel, the knowledge of Jesus Christ, the knowledge of the commandments, the things we need to do to get into heaven, the knowledge of the Our Father and the Hail Mary. I wouldn't trade that for anything in the world. The ability to pray, the rosary, the knowledge of Holy Communion and confession, the sacraments. Jesus died on the cross to give us these 7 sacraments. This is true wealth. The faith, the sacraments, prayer, the commandments, the knowledge of the gospel, the works of mercy. This is true riches. This is going to get us grace in eternity. Our chance to be eternal millionaires, so to speak, in grace, where it counts. The money in this world is going to be gone forever when we leave. And eventually it says God's going to make a new heaven and a new earth. But the currency of heaven is grace. And we get it through faith and prayer and obedience. So let's do what Jesus says. Jesus says, provide for yourselves money bags that do not wear out, an inexhaustible treasure in heaven. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be.